Good morning, everybody. I'm George McCarthy from the Ford Foundation. Everybody calls me Mac, so you won't get confused. Oops, we need to back that up. Hang on a sec. There we are. I'm really pleased to be here with you today with Mayor Kasim Reed of Atlanta, Georgia, Leila Janah from Samasource, and Victor Dallant from urb.im. And we're going to talk to you about the Just City. But first, I wanted to just explain to you kind of the format of the session so you'll understand why we have two empty seats on the end of the stage. So what we're doing what we call a fishbowl, where all the discussion that takes place in the room takes place up here. We're not going to have the opportunity to walk around with microphones to have people lob questions in from the audience. But instead, if somebody wants to join the discussion, they're going to have to make themselves known to my partner in crime over here, Ben Hecht, who will be walking around, and he'll invite you to come join us in the discussion in these two seats. And then when you're done, we'll ask you to leave so someone else can take those seats. So all discussion will take place on the stage with whomever will be brave enough to come up. Now, one of the things that we want is someone that's going to be brave enough to come up and talk to us about the orientation of the private sector towards the Just City and in urban social justice. So I just want you to think about that. We'll give you the opportunity after we make a few opening comments to decide if you want to join us. And like I said, Ben will be walking around. If you find these little pieces of paper, there's some of them on the seats, otherwise Ben can give you one. I just ask you to write your name so Ben will know who you are and the topic that you would like to talk about, okay? We've done this in the past. It's been usually a very good interactive session. We generally have people who are shy about getting up, and by the end of the session, we'll have 8 people waiting to take the last 2 seats, so you'll want to get there early. Okay, so the Just City. So what do we mean by the Just City? I want to just share with you a quote from, of course, my screen goes off, from Catherine Boo, her much acclaimed recent novel called Behind the Beautiful Forevers is about life in a slum in Mumbai. And in the book she says, Anawati, which is the name of the slum where people who live there, who are mostly garbage pickers, sat 200 yards off the Sahar Airport Road, a stretch where New India and Old India collided and made New India late. So for us, our proposition is this, that a just city is not a luxury, but a just city is a prerogative if we want to move forward with into a prosperous, sustainable future for humanity. We think that it's no longer an option to allow large numbers of people to live in informal settlements, informally employed, in isolated, both socially and economically impoverished situations in the cities of the world. And we think that the cities that do a better job at being able to provide the benefits of urban life to everybody more equitably and in better ways will be more successful, more competitive in the global economy going forward. So we're committed now to find ways to make cities more just, and we're here today to talk just about that. What do we do to make cities more just, more prosperous, more sustainable, and better for everybody? Cities that we'll all be proud to call home in the next 50 years. Now, I'll remind you of the urgency of that because cities are already the dominant settlement pattern for humans on the planet. More than half of people live in cities, and in the next 40 years, all of the growth of the human population will take place in cities. We're going to add 2.3 billion people to cities by the year 2050. And by the year 2050, we should have about 6 billion people residing in cities. The question for us is, how will they reside and what quality of life will they be assured of? And what can we do now to make sure that the quality of life will be as outstanding as we know it can be if we all put our minds to it and make life as good as it can be? All right, so we're going to talk about ways that we make the city just by connecting people. We're going to connect people to the mainstream of opportunity, the mainstream connecting where they live to where they can work, connecting them into the economic mainstream through the kinds of opportunities that they can find in the labor force, and also connecting cities themselves to each other so that everybody can learn from the successes from one place to another. So I want to start with a map. And this is a map of Atlanta, Georgia, where Mayor Reed currently enjoys life quite well.
I do.
And I think the citizens of Atlanta enjoy him extensively too. I've seen him in action. They love him there. Now, if you can see the little green dots on the map, the little green dots on the map are where subsidized housing is in Atlanta. Subsidized housing, which is predominantly occupied by people who are impoverished, very low income. And the dark colors in the map, the redder shades of the map, are a map of where there's opportunity for advancement in the region. And so you see that in the region, the major red areas are in the northwest quadrant of the city. There's some below. But you'll also notice that there's very little kind of correlation between where the low-income housing is and where the opportunities for advancement in the city are. So Mayor Reed, as mayor, what do you do about that? How do you find ways to make sure that people aren't isolated economically and socially in your city? And what are you going to do to make that happen in the next, say, 10 years?
We're going to have the greatest investment in connecting our communities than we've had in the history of the state. On July 31st, we have a vote for a referendum that will fund a 1% sales tax that will create about $7 billion in infrastructure investment. About 55% of that will be rail and light rail. The balance will be a mixture of road improvements, and we will radically improve our connectivity. Now, this will be done across a 10-county area. So we've really thrown politics aside, and we have a very conservative state. So I have a Republican governor, 2 Republican U.S. senator, a Republican speaker, and a Republican lieutenant governor, and we're putting up for a vote a 1% sales tax in the state of Georgia on July 31st. And the elected officials across the region voted to do this unanimously. So that would have been unheard of in Georgia just 10 years ago. And what that means is we're going to have an extraordinary amount of connectivity, so people, no matter where they live in the city of Atlanta, will be able to reach the jobs and the opportunities that are set forth in the map. There is one point that I would like to discuss just briefly. Atlanta is a little different culturally. People really don't desire to move to the places that many people externally may view as most attractive, Mac. So, for example, I live in the same neighborhood that I've lived in since I was 2 years old, and most of my friends do, and I candidly could afford to live in most places. But I choose to live where I live. So the map really will not change. What we hope will happen is that folks will have greater opportunity to have stronger jobs, better incomes, but it's not likely they would move.
And the rail that you're planning to build is going to run, the light rail is going to run all around the perimeter of the city.
Yeah, we have an initiative in Atlanta called the Atlanta Beltline, where we're going to expand to create 1,300 acres of green space. The Beltline is a 22-mile connector that runs for the circumference of the city. And then we will have an east-west line that we're building right now that's funded 50% in partnership with the federal government. And so it will slice the city on an east-west fashion and connect to the Atlanta Beltline. I put $602 million into the referendum that we have on July 31st, and it's really to help us with that last mile connectivity. So right now, our public transit system leaves people 8 or 9 blocks from where they probably want to end up. When we improve our light rail, folks will be 2 or 3 blocks away. So we'll have that real kind of last mile connectivity that many folks in older cities are used to and accustomed to. And we'll do it above ground with a state-of-the-art light rail system.
And I think you have a picture here that you sent us a map with the percentage of people taking transit to work, right? There were at least 20% of households have no car. This is actually quite extraordinary. In the city of Atlanta, there's lots of people who live without cars.
Well, we actually think that that's going to be good for the future because our public transit system handles about 400,000 passengers a year. And everybody knows that the world is moving towards cars being less and less desirable. Certainly with the generation of young people who are coming along, cars really aren't the kind of priority that they used to be. And that's really where we're experiencing the fastest growth in our city, really is among young people. We've got 57 colleges and universities in the Atlanta metro area. We're the home of Emory University, for example, Georgia Tech, for example, Spelman, Morehouse, some really special colleges and universities. So we think that they're going to want to use light rail, they're going to want to use bikes, they're going to want to be able to walk, and that's why we're investing a massive amount of money in building out more than $7 billion in infrastructure.
Great, and I think that, I'm sure you'll agree that the decisions we make here in Atlanta in the next 2 or 3 years are going to determine the shape of the city probably for the next 150 years.
Oh, there's no question about it. I mean, on this week, on this Thursday, we will open Hartsfield-Jackson International Terminal that will connect the city of Atlanta to 50 countries, 75 international destinations. We have the busiest passenger airport on the planet. We handle 20 million more passengers than Beijing International. We just working in a bipartisan fashion with the governor, got permission to deepen the port of Savannah. Our port in Georgia is the fastest growing port on the eastern seaboard. When the Panamax ships open, when the Panama Canal is expanded in 2014, we view that as a real opportunity for job creation and growth. We're expanding air cargo at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport by more than 10% year over year over the last 3 years. And we have the largest concentration of Fortune 500 businesses in Atlanta than everybody else in the United States of America except for 2 other cities. So we think these decisions that we're making right now are absolutely key.
Well, thanks. So we'll come back to this, but so the first act of our play, we're connecting people to opportunity with transportation. We're finding a way to link people into the promise of cities by making sure that they are able to get from where they live to where the opportunities are, be they employment opportunities, educational opportunities, or just the opportunity to live with a better quality of life with these new park systems. But now, another way that we're actually trying to make cities more just is to find ways to move people from informal employment, informal settlement, into the economic mainstream. And so I'd like to introduce Leila, Janah, who is the founder of Samasource. And Leila, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you do at Samasource to actually bridge people from informality to a more formal existence.
Sure, and I thought I would frame my comments by referring back to Catherine Boo's book, which is phenomenal, Behind the Beautiful Forevers. Read it if you haven't already. Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and it's Catherine Boo, B-O-O. One of the points that she makes in her book, as we're so excited about these mega cities in India, is something that I think Gandhi first said, that progress in any society should be measured by how we treat our worst off, not by how well we do at the top. And I think it's something that we're forgetting. I see it across the US, and I think we're forgetting it internationally as well. And so to me, a just city is about the sorts of economic and social opportunities that are available to the poorest segment of society. So Samasource, I founded in late 2008 to address a need that I saw persistently in my work in international development. I used to work at the World Bank. And every time I talk to a poor person in a developing country, and it's important to remember that 4 billion people now around the world live on less than $3 a day. That's adjusted for purchasing power. So that's 2005 US dollars. So imagine being sent to New York with $3 in your pocket and having to survive for a day in 2005. And that's the reality for 4 billion people on the planet. So this was the demographic that I was working with as a development economist. And every time I talked to a poor person on the ground and asked, what should we be doing at the World Bank or at various NGOs that I worked with, what should we be doing to help you? And they would all say the same thing. They would say, well, it's wonderful that you're building this infrastructure or that you're investing in education or at a high level helping our government, but really I just need a job. So could you maybe employ me as a translator on your project or somebody to take notes? And I kept hearing this need over and over again. And what I realized is that there are very, very few decently paying jobs available to the poor, including those who have benefited from an education. So to give you some sense of this, in Kenya, where now 95% of people under 30 can read and write in English, there's 70% unemployment coming out of the main university there. So even those who are fortunate enough to have received this investment in their education, and even those who are fortunate enough to live in countries like Kenya, which is pretty well supported by international institutions, they're still shortchanged when they finish school and there's nothing for them to do. And this is, in my view, what gives rise to a lot of the violence that we see, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a large population of unemployed young men who now know what they're missing, and they're totally aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. They have Facebook on their mobile phones. This is part of the reason that we saw the Arab Spring. So Samasource connects people living in poverty, like the folks that I've mentioned, to work via the internet. And we have an interesting model which we developed called micro-work, which divides large data projects from very wealthy Silicon Valley companies that include eBay and Walmart and LinkedIn. We divide work from them into these small units, and then we send out those units of work to about 2,500 people living in 6 countries. And those people log in through local internet cafes to do the work on computers and get paid a flat salary per month plus a bonus based on their performance. And in this way, we've actually paid out $2 million to about 2,500 people, and that affects about 10,000 in the regions that we work in. So it's a really interesting model, partly because we've been able to take this enormous wealth that we're seeing now in Silicon Valley. I live in this very weird bubble era. I know we experienced another one in 2001 where the people around me are becoming overnight millionaires because they were lucky enough to get equity in some of these big companies. And what's incredible about our model is that we deploy that capital for the purposes of international development. It's one way you can look at it. We're taking money from rich companies like eBay and we're sending it to some of the poorest parts of the world through a market-based mechanism. And another really interesting feature of the model is that these people who we help, we're often helping in their own neighborhoods. So we have a center in Kibera, which is a slum in Nairobi, that employs people using Wi-Fi and laptops in Kibera. So they get to avoid the 1.5 or 2 hour commute that they usually have to endure to go and find factory work on the outskirts of the city. And I think particularly as Mayor Reed mentioned, transportation issues are really a problem for the poor. You know, if you have to live 2 hours from where you work and you also have children, you have to fund childcare, you might come back late at night when it's not safe, and there's a whole host of other issues. So another part, I think, of our Just City conversation is providing economic opportunity to people in their own neighborhoods.
And part of the issue is, the social justice issue is how we pay people. And can you tell me a little bit about how you set your wage scale for the places that you work?
Sure. So I should mention we operate in many ways like a business, but we are a 501c3. We're a nonprofit in the U.S. And we intentionally formed as a nonprofit because we realized that we would get pressured to abandon our mission if we were too focused on profit. So we try to be sustainable. It would be great if we broke even. We're about 50% funded through Earned Income now. So the way that we set wages is using a tool called the Fair Wage Guide, which was developed originally to work with artisans in very poor countries. It was developed by an organization that was selling like fair trade handicrafts through eBay called World of Good. And they developed this guide in partnership with fair wage specialists and artisan advocates in the US. They developed this guide for paying people in urban and rural locations in every country in the world, and they established what a reasonable cost of living is in each of those locations. So that's the floor. And usually with the kind of work that we do, that pays well above what anybody would make in the informal sector. So we're seeing wages of roughly $1 an hour, which is what many people make per day in the informal sector in the regions that we work.
So can you tell us a little bit about some of the people that you've helped to find work? And
sure.
I can advance these, or I can give you the clicker.
Yeah, you can just go through to the woman. I think I'll start after Tony here. So this is a woman who I met last summer. Her name is Jacqueline, and she's in her home. You can see there she lives in a one-room shanty. Jacqueline is actually among the wealthier people in the slum that she lives in because there's a decent roof over her building, and she has access to a latrine nearby, and she can get access to a public tap water facility where she has to pay per bucket for the water that she gets. So this is being relatively well off in a slum in Kenya. And part of the reason that she's better off is that she took a job with Samasource about a year ago. It was her first formal job. I think Jacqueline's now about 25. And she grew up to a single mom. She has 2 younger sisters. And though she's college educated, she had finished about a year of college, she had been unable to find work. In Kenya, there's just such competition for formal jobs that you have to come from a middle-class background to really be considered. And there's a lot of discrimination against people who are very low income. So Jacqueline couldn't find a job, and she got hired by one of our centers. We force the centers that we work with to hire people from lower income brackets. So it's like a reverse recruiting process for them. Usually they're looking for people who are better off, who've been better educated, who have a little bit more polish, and we go and tell them they have to find people who don't meet those criteria. So our center manager, one of our center managers in Nairobi, found Jacqueline, employed her for a year, and then she saved enough money to go back to school, and now she works part-time in a computer repair shop, which is a better paying job and something that she'd always wanted to do. So most of our workers transition after about a year into higher paying work or into higher education.
Thanks, and we'll come back to some of your other folks in a minute. All right, so that's Act 2, right? Act 1, we connect people to where they live, to opportunities. Act 2, we actually find a bridge from informality to formality, and one of the things that that Leila really stressed in the times we've talked before is that if they hire someone to work on contract at Samasource for a year or 2, they're more often than not poached by other employers who want people now with the kinds of skills they have, and so she puts them on contract, but then she can find ways to get other people employed. Before I turn to Victor, I want to remind you that Ben is here with a microphone with pieces of paper. Please make yourself known to Ben, and Ben will invite you up to join the conversation because you don't have the luxury of lobbing in questions from the audience. You have to join us up here if you want to get involved, okay? All right, so now, Act 3. Now we're trying to find ways to virtually connect people who are trying to make just and sustainable cities all over the world. And my friend Victor created a thing called urb.im. And Victor, why don't you just tell us what exactly is urb.im? And do you want this to advance the slides?
Yes, please.
Would you just pass it down? It's green for forward, red for reverse.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, it does work. Yes, even though I am always on the internet, and I strongly believe in the internet where I don't trust the internet. So in this particular case, you will see only screenshots because you never know whether the internet connection will work when you're on stage. Leila and I have met each other, I believe, is it like maybe 4 or 5 years ago on the internet. Of course, you know, we put Samasource's blog, her personal blog, on another platform that we're running, Social Edge, and it has been absolutely fabulous to see the progress that she has made in the past 4 years. And it gave us an idea here. It just made us realize that there's a way to connect practitioners and other members of an ecosystem online. So we came up with this concept, which is called Urbim, or urb.im. It's an embarrassing thing that you may not see. Oh yeah, you can see the top near the logo. Now, Urbim, Latin for city, or if you look at it this way, urb.im, it could be also urban impact, urban impulse, or maybe urban implosion.
Let's hope not.
That's up to you to decide, and that's up to us to work on that so that it just becomes, you know, the good urban impact. The philosophy of this online platform is really to connect all members of the ecosystem working in urban poverty alleviation. And what I mean by members of this ecosystem, it could be practitioners, urban planners, government officials, and funders as well. The other goal of this platform is, of course, to propagate innovation and practices, best practices, as well as epic failures. We love epic failures as much as we can grab them. They're very hard to get. As you can imagine, most social innovators don't like to share their failures, but it is something that we're trying to grab and promote as well. So why are we doing this in the first place? Because we realized that there's a lack of communication from city to city. And actually, in some cases, you'd be surprised, even within cities. And I'll just give you an example. We were in Detroit, Michigan, just a week or 2 ago, and we talked to social innovators who actually told us whoever is working in Northeast Detroit doesn't even talk to those people who are in Southwest Detroit. So imagine what the problem is for those people working in Nairobi. They have no clue what's happening in Rio, most likely. Or those people working in Mumbai don't know what's happening in Lagos or Mexico City. So this is why we launched this platform. As you can tell on the homepage, that's this week's homepage, today's homepage, it's about mapping. So we have a whole series around mapping of communities in 6 cities. And as you can see on the column on the right-hand side, you have the list of the 6 cities, and each one has one particular feature about mapping of communities. Why mapping? It's one of the most important things that we can do, is to describe what we call the slums. They're not slums. They are informal settlements. People live there. People work there. People are born there. People have actually addresses, and in some cases they have electricity and water. Yes, they live extremely poorly, but they're actually real cities. And that is something that is extremely important to mention to government officials and urban planners. These are cities, these are neighborhoods. They are not just slums, or as sometimes they pretend, fields. They are actually people living there. So let me mention this quote. I love absolutely, Marco Kusumawijaya, who is based in Jakarta. We need to switch from the globalization of competition to the globalization of solidarity. That is a very important thing to remember, because we need to share this knowledge. That's what I said, practices, best practices on failures, as well as innovation. But look at this as well. Jack Macao in Nairobi. We scale up by sharing. We are all good at actually making things happen in our organizations, but we're not so good at sharing the stories and telling the stories. So that's where we come in. We are here to share the stories between Nairobi and Lagos and Mexico City and Rio de Janeiro and Mumbai and Jakarta as well. And I will give you another example of the field research we did to come up with this concept. We were in Bamako, in Mali, in West Africa, and we met this social entrepreneur with about a small team, about 30 people working in waste management in the city of Bamako. And we asked him this question, very basic question: do you know what your counterparts are doing, let's say east, Ouagadougou, which is about maybe 300 kilometers or so? And he said, yes, we have been talking to them. Good. And I said, when was the last time you talked to them? Well, 9 years ago. And so, well, why have not you reached out to them? Well, we had their phone numbers, but they may have moved. Like people maybe switched to mobile phones. And then we asked them the same question. Well, how about West, Dakar, which is about 3, maybe 500 kilometers? Are you in touch also with your counterparts in Dakar? And the fellow said, yes, I read an article not maybe 3 or 4 years ago. They seem to be ahead of us, in terms of financing and everything. So we thought, okay, if somebody in Bamako doesn't even have the means to connect with somebody in Ouaga or in Dakar, there's a need for this kind of platform. So again, this is about scaling by sharing information. It's a complex platform. It is 6 nodes for now, 4 languages. So I showed you English, and this one, of course, is in Spanish. That's Mexico City. We're also in Portuguese for Brazil, and we are also in Indonesian, which is makes it a bit challenging. But for that, we have a global team. And what I mean by global team is not just an international team. So we have somebody who's from Colombia who's living in Brazil, and she is actually our key person in Rio. Very interesting background. She went to the London School of Economics, and she got a master's degree in urban planning, and she just finished a fellowship at MIT. In Nairobi, I think we have a British citizen. In Mumbai, we have an American citizen. I think in Jakarta, how boring, we have an Indonesian, and in Lagos we have a Nigerian. But again, the concept is to have those people rotate from one city to the other, to just keep them, on the edge, as we like to put it. So, when we're talking about 6 cities, and I've mentioned what these are: 2 in Africa, Lagos and Nairobi; 2 in Central and South America, Mexico City and Rio de Janeiro; 2 in Asia, Jakarta and Mumbai. The idea is that we have to grow, and we strongly believe in organic growth. What we will see, I suspect, in the next few months, that there will be requests coming from other smaller cities to be part of this network. And what we will be able to give them is access to the technology, access to the branding, access to our resources. We are based in San Francisco and California, and we can help them, and hopefully they will be able to provide stories, information, practices, failures, and connection to actually grow this network as much as possible. Now, we're in Paris, so of course I'm supposed to pitch here. You realize that I told you that this platform is in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, Indonesian, and it's not in French. So if you know somebody here at the Ministère des Affaires étrangères or La Coopération, we would love to launch a platform, let's say in Dakar or Abidjan, for West French-speaking Africa. See, Mac, I'm always pitching. You never know, we can do better than that.
Well, we know there are pitches made all over the place, and I noticed that Atlanta is not on the map yet. So, Mayor Reed was very good at pitching Atlanta in the green room, and I want to know how are we going to get Atlanta onto your map?
Actually, that's a very, very interesting question. As I told you, we were doing some field research recently in Detroit. We have also gone to Oakland and Newark, San Diego. We're visiting quite a few places in the US. I've not been to Atlanta yet. And I should tell you how eye-opening it has been. We always thought that, urban poverty would be different in, let's say, the developing world as it would be in the US. It's not that different. When you think about the pyramid of development, assuming that we are at the very top because we are the founders, we are the practitioners, at the very top of, writing white papers and distributing information. And if you look at the base of the pyramid, the urban poor, I always thought that in the US you would have the possibility to reach out to the urban poor, if only because they have access to technology, smartphones. I am wrong. I was wrong. This is actually not true. And just being in Detroit and looking and doing some research and finding out how many people have access to smartphones, internet connections, broadband, it's not that different from the numbers we found in Nairobi or in Mumbai. And that was really eye-opening. And not only in terms of access to technology, access to education, access to, I would say, civic engagement. I mean, we found out that, I don't know if you know that, but the number of people who vote actually in a Detroit urban, in a city, is only 20%, 20%. So when you talk about, a lack of civic engagement, lack of access to technology and, and communications devices, we realize actually that the problem is not so different, which means that most likely the solution will be very similar. And again, there's this lack of communications between organizations, let's say in Northeast Detroit and Southwest Detroit. So we have to be global, but we have also to be local, and sometimes we have to be hyper-local, which makes it even more complex. That's where those technologies come in.
Thanks, Victor. So Ben, what's
Yes,
going on out in the audience here?
We've got somebody who wants to talk about financing the Just City.
Financing the Just City.
So we get to bring you up to the chair, and hopefully this will work out, and others will have the guts, thank you, to participate as well. Anybody need a piece of paper?
Come on, we need some more people to come up here and talk to us about the private sector. What is the private sector going to do to make the cities more just? So identify yourself, please, and join the conversation.
Greg Hummel, a partner with Brian Cave Law Firm in Chicago. What I'm interested in grew out of the first territorial review by the OECD of a Chicago-based region, or actually a US-based region. And it was Chicago and 21 contiguous counties. And one of the facts that large report disclosed is that in that geography, we have $1 billion given away each year by our foundations. But I would submit in a wholly uncoordinated way. Individual silos within those foundations. MacArthur alone has $300 million that they deploy, frankly, across the world. One of the things I do in my day job is try to put deals together. And in some of these communities that are really at risk, the missing capital is the angel investment piece, the venture capital piece. So one of the things I'd like to explore, is there a way that we can create an enterprise fund that's regionally focused that then works into individual projects and provides that critical seed funding, which is so often missing. And to relate it to a specific, and the last gentleman's comments about it's not really that different in cities. There's a neighborhood in the west side of Chicago where we have the highest incidence of ex-cons coming back in and trying to enter the marketplace. And that is also the home of something called Austin Polytech, which is a vocational school that offers an advanced certificate in metalworking. And trying to get funding from the philanthropic and government community to attract businesses to invest in that neighborhood is the goal. But I think there's a bigger idea here. And my question, I guess, is how we can coordinate that type of effort across, with that kind of giving in a 21 county region. That's an awful lot of money, but it doesn't seem to flow in a sensible way. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Who has thoughts about venture capital, seed funding?
Well, I think that a great deal of that falls on the leader of the city. I think that the mayor has the ability to have convening power. So the way that you do it, one is to have a number of tools. So in Atlanta, we have a number of initiatives. One just this past week in my office was Muhammad Yunus, the father of microcredit, was in my office. So we're going to be exploring how to raise a fund so we can have an active microcredit facility in Atlanta, and really to go beyond that to extend credit and capital to small businesses. In Atlanta, we have one of the most aggressive small and women business initiatives in the United States of America. I think that we do more business with small and women-owned businesses by percentage than any other major city in the United States of America. So that is another tool that we have at our disposal. We're also very aggressive with interacting with our private sector because you know that the real wealth and the real opportunity lies in the private sector. So the mayor has the ability to advance that argument. But what we really like to see are initiatives that work, because I will share with you that the one thing that we have to have when we go into these spaces are models that work. Because elected officials that take the risk and implement initiatives such as micro-lending, such as the old empowerment zone model, are held accountable for how those businesses turn out for years to come. So having an opportunity to share this platform today and learn about the initiatives that are going on helps me, because it gives me a model that works. And every time you have a leader that has a model that works, it's more likely that we can replicate it and get it off of the ground faster. So I'm excited about both opportunities. And what I think we'll leave here with is a relationship where if there's an interest in partnering with the city of Atlanta, then the door will be open and readily available. But that's how we do it. You really have to deploy an all of the above approach with highly competent and talented people right now. Because I will tell you, elected officials just don't get a lot of do-overs.
And from the point of view of philanthropy, I mean, we're always looking for ways in which we can leverage investment. But real leverageable investments don't actually just kind of find their way to your door as easily as you might think. And there's lots of people have lots of ideas about how you should use your money, right? Yeah. But it's not really clear which are the right ones and how to really find your way to leverage the private market. Because ultimately, in Atlanta, they're talking about raising billions of dollars to finance infrastructure that's going to change the city for the next century, right? But we need to find a way to take small amounts of money to begin to build the flows that become the billions that actually are needed, most of which are going to come from the public sector and private sector. But Leila, talk about, how do you raise money? Where do you get money to build new centers in the U.S. or new centers in other places in the world?
Speaking of pitches, if anyone wants to donate, I can give you my card after this.
I was first.
I think you had 2 points. One was about gathering funders together to get the most leverage out of their investment, and the second was about the best way to invest in smaller, kind of more innovative ideas. So I can speak to the latter point as both a beneficiary and at times a victim of some funding processes. I think one of the biggest challenges for a small organization, to give you some context, our budget is about $4 million a year annually, our operating budget. And then on top of that, we have sales of about 2 to 4 million annually. So a relatively small organization. And we're piloting something that's really new. And one of the challenges with doing that is that funders in the philanthropic community are notoriously afraid of failure. And that needs to change if we want to fund innovation. In Silicon Valley, where I come from, it's standard in the venture capital world for 9 out of 10 investments to completely tank. And at best, you'll have one that does really well. Often you'll have a few that do moderately well or break even, and one that's spectacular. But there's really the assumption that most of your money will actually be invested in failures, but because of that success, that then carries over and funds the failure. And I think part of the challenge in the venture philanthropy world is that there isn't that comfort with failure yet. And so that's one point. The second point is that the application processes, and I don't know if any of you here run smaller organizations, but they're incredibly onerous. We've been asked to develop 50-page proposals in the past for grants that are $100,000. So that means that I have to employ 2 people full-time just to write a proposal, when in fact the people that we're trying to help don't need us to be writing proposals. They need us to be finding work for them, making sure the work gets done well. So I think part of this could be solved through like a common application for grants or for smaller, maybe for funding that's under 100K. And also the sector, I think, needs to trust the leaders that they invest in and realize that, if we're choosing to leave behind private sector jobs to enter the nonprofit world, we're probably doing it for good reasons. And as long as there are reasonable outcomes that are tracked, and as long as there's a reasonable method for tracking outcomes, then how you account for every dollar shouldn't probably be, well, it's not in the interest of the funder to really track that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you've nailed it. It's the risk aversion. Chicago is a middle market banking town, and it's all about making conventional loans. And it's hindering our whole economy. We're trying to create a venture capital climate. But in the social investing realm, it's hugely important. If you can't raise that early money, and you may well lose it, that's critical. And a common fund application would make a huge amount of sense.
May I take the opposite side, if I may? And I strongly believe, of course, in financing innovation and taking risks. When do you stop? At what point do you realize that you're funding something that is not working and not delivering any impact? And I'll give you an example. We were recently talking again to a leader of an organization saying, I have been at this for 25 years, and it's only in the past 5 years that we are seeing some traction. So how do you interpret this? Well, we wasted a lot of resources, or it is a generation process. I mean, it takes a generation to deliver social impact. So you can see it both ways. But when you go back to a large program, let's say Saving Detroit, because I was there last week, so I'm still thinking about this. We need to make the case why we need to save a city. It's not clear to us why we absolutely need to save a city. Cities come and go, they disappear. Of course, we should not forget the human element. We have people living in that city. We need to save the people. We need to have them as human beings. But do we really need to invest that much money in a city just because there was a city? I mean, let's look at your books of history. How many cities have disappeared? And it's okay. Move on. So, yes, I'm all for, of course, financing innovation. I live in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, so of course I'm all for that. But in some cases, you have to look at the long term of history and say, we're moving from one industry, from your industry to services, to intellectual talent, and maybe it's time to realize that those cities will evolve, change, move on. And it's a hard decision to make.
We have a new guest that's arrived
Yeah, so
in the
I actually
conversation.
want to switch up Greg, have him come back out, and there's 2 questions about technology, so I thought we'd do them both at the same time.
Okay, great. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Arun Jan. I'm an urban designer and urban strategist, and the last regular job I held was chief urban designer for the city of Portland, Oregon. My issue is really about more at a basic level, which is how do we define the problem and how do we measure success? And a lot of the issue is there's some underlying assumptions here, which is one, that technology will transcend social problems, including access. The other is that, it's coming from an idea that informal settlements actually have very deep and rich social infrastructure. And so economic development needs to be tempered to what would be most beneficial to not destroying those social infrastructures. And then there's a deeper sort of issue for me, which is what exactly is the role of institutions in bridging what the existing political construct is and financial construct is just simply unable to do.
So it's interesting. I started off talking about Catherine Boo's book, and Leila mentioned it too. One of the interesting things I took away from that book was that she, in some ways, claimed that this proposition that there's a rich kind of social networking and a rich social support structure in the slums. She questions that actually quite starkly. She says, in fact, she didn't think that there was a lot of social network that could be leverageable, and that the social structure itself and all the systems that supported life surrounding that slum were actually working very hard to make sure that people never left. So it's a big question, because the institutions that we're thinking about trying to change, to fix, whatever, are they the cultural institutions that we presume exist, or do they really exist? And are they the kinds of things that we can leverage in the way that we would hope to be able to leverage them? I don't know, because it was actually quite depressing for me to read that book and say, I'd always assumed that one of the invisible public goods that you see in the slums is the actual support system that helps people survive on next to nothing, when in fact in the book she makes a pretty compelling case that it doesn't happen, right?
If I might respond to that, I'll give it as a sociological example. In India, if you have, in many times, a situation where you have a mother with 2 children living in a room, and they're living room by room, right? And she needs to run out for a small task that might give her some money. She's able to yell across to the other room, tell the other mother, can you take care of my kids for an hour or two while I go out and do that? Now, if you work really hard, I've seen situations where, very clever architects and very clever planners end up developing small units that are individualized, where people have running water and essential facilities critical to well-being. On the other hand, that socialization ability, a mother who's basically barely able to afford a better unit doesn't have necessarily the same sort of social network to say, I can run out on a dime to basically go out and do this. So the point is, from my point of view, some of you may disagree, it's about creating social opportunity in the slums, in the informal settlements, that basically allow people to ramp themselves up in terms of a progressive quality of life in the informal settlement, and then get out of it at appropriate sort of moments. So it's not a let's replace it, which tends to be the general sort of city approach, but it's more about progressive cumulative enhancement and creating a stable platform in which they can truly move out of it and do something better.
Well,
And I think that's why we call what we're trying to do, to build just and inclusive cities. So it's really about including those populations living in those informal settlements, being part of the economic system, of course, but also education, and we talked about civic engagement. It's just realizing that they don't live apart. They should be part of the process, the political process and the decision-making process. So I think that's why we sometimes we call just and sustainable cities, but I think we much prefer just and inclusive cities. That would help a lot, and hopefully technology can be part of this.
well, I actually think that we're actually in a unique time in the world where we shouldn't miss the moment, because making the kind of community that you describe is really going to be key to all of our economies. So the world is really about markets now. I mean, the reason that there's so much discussion around China and India is because of the size of the market, and you have people that have fundamental talents if well trained, right? So the excitement really is about markets. And what I'm seeing is more and more decisions are being driven, and not for the more noble reasons that we would prefer, but they're ending up in noble results. So, for example, in my state of Georgia, I am seeing extremely harsh criminal penalties being modified, not out of a sign of political weakness, but because the state can't afford to put people in jail at the rate that they're putting in jail. So they're coming up with more thoughtful sentencing methodologies that we would discuss in this room as progressive, right? But the driver for that really is the balance sheet of the state. Similarly, in the United States, Tom Friedman talks about it at length in his book, That Used to Be Us, where you're losing economic productivity of black people, Latino people, and rural kids. It's worth about $400 billion a year. Over 10 years, that's about $4 trillion. And that happens to be the amount of money that we talk about in terms of the U.S. debt and needing to resolve our debt and deficit crisis. So what should be a moral progressive idea, which is to maximize human capital and expand markets, right, really is being driven by a capitalist notion of having markets. So I think that we ought to be focused on marrying the moment, if you will, where thoughtful people like the ones that attend this conference are going to have a greater opportunity to make our case and make our point. And then the private sector is going to respond because the private sector has a selfish motive and it needs to respond to grow its markets.
The old invisible hand of Adam Smith. Sir, you've joined our conversation. Introduce yourself and let us know what's on your mind.
Hello, I'm Peter Hirschberg from San Francisco, and I'm co-founder of the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. And we have noticed in San Francisco that when we combine kind of the rapid prototyping ethos of the tech community with urban problems, that we've come up with what we call the urban prototyping movement, where we'll bring in 200 people over a weekend, and through the hackathon process, which is basically you pick a problem and 48 hours later you come up with a prototype solution, that we're able to come up with ideas and prototypes for the city that advance things more rapidly than traditional planning that goes on for years. So for example, last weekend we did one in the Tenderloin, which is a disadvantaged part of town, and in fact if you go survey them, there's no smartphones, no computers, and there's about 50% feature phone deployment. It would look like going to a developing community in Africa. But working together with 200 people who came in for the weekend to code and design things, they actually came up with about 20 prototypes that were offered up to the city after about 48 hours. So one example was people spend, if you're homeless, you spend an awful lot of time looking for a shelter. But you have very little time to go look for work. So could a reservation system be built using just an ordinary feature phone? And so that was kind of prototyped, and then there were like 6 or 7 winners. They all got a little bit of money, and now they're working with the city. Can that be implemented? It turns out there's, from a sanitation point of view, if you're part of the homeless population, there are very few places to go. So could we design kind of a fountain situation where that could be done? So last summer, during the mayor's race, we ran several of these events, engaged each of the mayoral candidates to be a client for these projects. And by the time, and then presented all the winners, very much like the app competition here, presented that to the city. And what we've learned is that this is a form of civic participation beyond voting, beyond complaining. It's the maker movement. You get to go create things, and it's open data, and it's kind of designers and technologists coming together with, say, the nonprofits. We're now doing this in Singapore, and the plan is to take it to a number of countries in the world. But the realization or the observation is, at a time when you have kind of deployed mobile technology, open data so that you can kind of go build things with cities, and new forms of participating, just as social media in the last 10 years has given people a lot more of a role, are we beginning to see this in cities where we can actually engage people in working on their cities in ways that include citizens more than before? And our experience has been, this is a pretty thrilling thing because it gives more people a role and can improve an environment.
So I'm curious, the short piece we saw before from Waze, you guys funded that. Was that something that was created in a process like you described, where people got together and kind of decided that they're going to solve this problem of how to get around in the city and use crowdsourcing to kind of gather the data?
So Waze is much more of a traditional venture capital model, right? They raise money and they're kind of an ongoing business. But of course, the key point there is that got deployed and it used natural people's natural tendencies to want to share data, right? There is a gamification or there's the kind of like a natural movement. You want to share the data because you get something back, and in fact, our arts organization did the visualizations that you saw there earlier. But what we're finding is those same kinds of people will come together for the weekend and start building applications that would improve the city. For example, Muni, which is our transport system, has lots of bus data. We know where the buses are, but if you work in Muni, like you're one of the guys your job is to keep the buses running, you have no modern system. You have a clipboard and you have like a walkie-talkie. And the city said it would take 5 years to go build a system that would give the line workers data. And so we built it in 48 hours. And then create a little bit of, the city was not that proud that they hadn't done it, but that was kind of creating a little bit of competition there. So those same kinds of people aimed at urban problems seem to be able to propose really interesting solutions. The city said it would take 5 years to get green building data, like, how well is a building performing? And they teamed up with people and crowdsourced it. So it's really about bringing innovation and new ideas to things. And by having tech people learn from cities and mayors learn from tech people, that seems to be a form of innovation.
So let's talk a minute about low tech, because Victor shows us these splashy screens that are made up on the web. I don't think you can get to those with a regular little cell phone, right? And Leila has people running around with little notebooks doing work in slums, right? So how much of the solutions that we're talking about are the high-tech solutions, and how many of them are adaptive technology that works with a bunch of existing kinds of tech that isn't expensive and is much easier to get? I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I think there's been a general trend towards consumer technology. I have friends in enterprise in Silicon Valley who say, the best stuff is developed by Apple for consumers. It's no longer the case that the best stuff is within enterprise software. And we see that a lot. We work with a lot of big companies, and people are really frustrated that their companies don't issue them iPhones and that they have to use this old school stuff. So I actually think that because of the consumer tech movement in the developed world, there's a lot of advantage for poorer communities to tap into this. A lot of the best stuff now is freely available online. I would argue that tools like Dropbox and Evernote, which are available to anyone, anywhere, that are free, are really much more powerful than software that was developed in the past you had to pay for. And I think similarly that there's been a trend to move everything into the cloud or onto the open web. So as long as you have a device that's capable of accessing a web browser, you can use a free browser like Google Chrome or Firefox, you can now access most of the stuff that anyone needs to do work in the modern world. It's our goal at Samasource to make all of our machines software free. So the idea is that you could just simply have any device that can connect to the internet, whether that's a really basic, and some feature phones can connect to the internet through their web browser, or a simple tablet. The Indian Education Ministry just announced a $35 Android tablet. There's a new computer that's called the Raspberry Pi that costs $25 that connects to a basic screen and a keyboard. So I think the cost of the hardware is going to be a non-issue, and as long as the system is optimized for the open web, anyone who has access to the internet can use it. And we've certainly seen this trend in Kenya. Even people who don't have computers or on Facebook, they have a friend register for them online, and then they connect it to their mobile phone, and they're using it on their phone.
And I think that Leila mentioned the most important fact. It's not the hardware, it's not necessarily the software, it's access, it's the connection. That's usually the missing link. And when we build those platforms, we try to be extremely careful not to create, I would say, two classes of citizens, on the internet. Those, the haves, the people who have access to broadband, and those people who don't have access to broadband or to the internet or any fast connection. So we always make sure that they are easy to load, they're fast, and that people, wherever they are in the world, and not based on the speed of that connection, could actually access the information they need to. But that's really what the barrier is. Again, it's not hardware, it's not software, it's the network. It's access to the network.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that. For me, justice, opportunity, and decision-making power. And when you think about it in those terms, and you say, well, okay, how much accessibility, we're assuming universal accessibility to the internet. but we're living in a growing economic model, for example, that says we're going to charge for uploading data and downloading data. And when you look at percentages of how many people really have ongoing access to the internet, when you look at it in the developing world, they're still tiny fractions of what's really needed. And so when you get into those sort of realities, saying, yes, it's absolutely cool to have communications versus on smartphones or other devices that are somewhere in between a smartphone and a regular phone, I tend to think it's much more about getting timely information, not real-time information. And that's where I tend to go in the low-tech direction, saying there's a whole area of innovation that needs to be done, I think, from my perspective, that says, if I didn't have access to the internet, could I still get the information I actually need to make a good decision and feel empowered to do so?
So Mac, would you like to go back down to the ground?
Yes.
Away from technology? So we have someone here who wants to talk about housing diversity, and over here talking about violence, urban violence. So why
maybe
don't we
we'll ask our
displace
guests
our two guests
Yes,
and
thanks.
bring you two
That was a
back.
good
And
point.
we may not make it to everybody, Mac, but
Yeah, well, that's the price you pay for waiting, right? But one question that, just to close out this idea of tech, I mean, is an investment in connectivity to technology an essential feature to creating social capital in a new way? And if that's the case, then would we be advising foundations and other investors to make cheap connectivity kind of a priority, to really find a way to engage people, to connect them to the mainstream in their places?
Yes.
Yes.
Question.
What do you think, Mayor?
We have a duty to do that.
So it's free Wi-Fi is what we should
But
be.
it's-
Yeah.
We think of technology as something different than what it really is. It's infrastructure. This is like, should we have roads? Absolutely. Like, the internet is the roads of the future. And to me, if we're not investing in that for poor communities, we're doing them a greater disservice, in my mind, than if we're not investing in roads and basic public infrastructure. Information is as important as water and food and basic ground transportation, because it's all of your opportunity in the new economy.
Inclusive city.
Yes. Well, let's talk about housing.
Victor said inclusive city.
Oh, who are you, by the way?
Maxime Barkatz, I'm a real estate investor. You said before, Leila, that first thing people ask you that they want is a job, but I also feel that the first thing, maybe before a job, people want is a house, or maybe it comes together. I think there are two realities, and in this conference, you have people from developing countries in India and China where the needs are huge, and from the Western world, well, this is very different. So I have basically two questions about the best practices that maybe you can see on your network, and maybe Merid has experience in Atlanta. For the developing economies, and France was developing economies in the 50s and 60s, we saw that we had to build very quickly houses in a huge number so that we could bring newcomers to the city, immigrants and people from the countryside, to build and to get the jobs. I think in France it was very badly done, and today, or it was done, but I mean, today we feel the harsh consequences of how it was done, and every day you can see in the news problems in the banlieue, and unemployment for the youth, for the young people, which is around 50% in some areas around Paris. But I have a business in Morocco, and I go to Brazil very often. And I see basically that the same mistakes are being done once again, because it's so hard to build quickly that what the authorities are doing is taking huge pieces of land outside of the cities and building cheap and quick so that people can get a house, which is obviously better than the slum. And Morocco for this is at the top of the list of the UN for the prices it gets of getting people out of the slums. However, I'm convinced in 20 years, 25 years, that will be the same mess that it is in France. So my first question is about Greenfield, and which best practices do you see to match the urgency at the same emergency at the same time as having quality and inclusiveness. And my second question is more about brownfield developments and in more consolidated cities, such as in the US. I'm particularly interested in urban regeneration investments, but what I see is that it's never so easy, because when you want to do urban regeneration as an investor, it normally goes with gentrification. And at some point it's good because you make the neighborhood looks better, and you have shops that come and people who will come back to live. But at the same time, occupiers will have to go normally because they don't have the money to afford it. I remember going to New York when I was a kid, and walking around in Soho was dangerous, and or in Dumbo in Brooklyn, worst. And now I was there a month ago, and it's $1,000 a square foot or more, and obviously it's not the same people who live. So my second question is about how do you manage to do urban regeneration without having exclusion, having an inclusive urban regeneration?
Yeah, so let's start with the second question, actually, because I think it's an important question, and we grapple with it all the time in the United States, because do we fix the places and displace the people, or do you find a way to simultaneously fix the places and improve them for the people who are there? And Mayor, maybe you have some thoughts about this, because there's some areas of your city, Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I think right now you have maximum flexibility. You can do both. I think because of the collapse of the real estate market in the United States, you really can do both, because the city is in the position right now, real time, to acquire massive amounts of real estate in a variety of neighborhoods across the platform. And so we're figuring out, and the private market is having to figure out how they're going to use these properties. So we're in conversations with no less than 3 banks right now about actively acquiring their foreclosed portfolio. We're then going to work with private firms to place individuals in those houses from a variety of backgrounds. So you can do both right now, because Atlanta was moving towards a place where all of our real estate values in the city of Atlanta really were creating the kind of gentrification that you referenced. But the collapse in the real estate market has created a reset for that and given the city the opportunity to play a vastly different role in how that game is going to play out.
So, Victor, what do you see in slum upgrading and in place kinds of changes that are taking place in some of your nodes? Are there any best practices that you've been able to see?
Not yet. And unfortunately, we have not been able to identify solutions yet that actually work and that could be scalable and exported to other places. Not yet, but we're at the beginning of this experiment, so I'm hopeful.
I should probably preface this by saying that I'm not an expert in housing, but one thing that really scares me about the United States is we have this incredible bifurcation of the for-profit sector, which is completely profit-seeking and profit-maximizing, and then the nonprofit sector, where if you are trying to earn any money in your social enterprise, you're sort of seen as too capitalist. And I think we really need to break down that barrier, because to me, the best way to address a problem like public housing would be to have some kind of a differentiated pricing model, right? So you have one building, you charge very low-income people next to nothing to live there, and you charge higher-income people more to live there. And this model works really well for hospitals. It's used in a lot of charity hospitals where you can provide excellent quality care, and you simply charge more for it. You offer premium services to rich people. And I really think that because many philanthropic organizations are skeptical of that model, we're not using it to address problems like housing. So what happens, I've seen, is that people, low-income housing ends up becoming really dilapidated, becomes a place where crimes are committed. Then richer people in the area get annoyed by that, and they lobby the city to close down the housing. And then poor people are forced to move far outside the city, where they then have to commute hours to get into their jobs. And I've seen this happen especially in poor cities in the developing world, where people say, oh, these slums are terrible, nobody wants to live there, there's open sewers, this is awful, we should move these people to decent housing, but then the decent housing is located far outside of where any economic opportunity is. And I just don't think that that's doing the poor any sort of service. So to me, models that use differentiated pricing, or in some cases a direct subsidy, where you offer people a credit and they can live wherever they want to live, and then you use market forces to create good housing, are some of the best ways forward. But I've heard that private sector organizations are more opposed to those models because they reduce profits.
Although, so there is one cautionary tale, and in the spirit of trying to learn from mistakes, in Mumbai, in Dharavi, one of the ideas was they were going to have to figure out how to build up, because it's vast and it's a very low-level slum. And so Spark went in and they built 2 high-rise towers that they were going to offer to people who would give up their places on the ground. And they were really kind of devastated to find out that people wouldn't trade their spaces in the slum on the ground to live in a actually fairly high-quality new development. And what they had failed to kind of take into account was that people don't just live in their houses, they also do commerce in their houses, right? And they weren't going to be willing to give up their ground rights, where they could do commerce and find shelter, to just find shelter in a higher quality place, because they would have no livelihood. And so one of the questions we have to really think about is, if we're going to be upgrading, let's do it appropriately so that it actually takes into account how people live their lives first, and then go on. Well, I can't let you talk because Caroline has to get in. Okay. We only have a few minutes, and Caroline, I know you, but introduce yourself to the rest of the audience.
Okay, my name's Caroline Moser, and I'm an academic. I'm actually a researcher, and I run a research centre on global urban development at the University of Manchester. And in a way, I feel a little out of place because I don't have a product like most of you guys. But I think that actually Max's comment just now illustrates exactly why you do need researchers. Because a lot of us could have said stupid around high-rise even before you did it, and I think I don't mean to be. No,
I didn't do it.
I don't mean to be detrimental or anything. Also, just to say as an aside, though it's not what I came to talk about, we've done longitudinal work in Guayaquil in Ecuador, and using an asset framework, and shown that you're quite right, that people want housing before they want anything else. Housing doesn't get you out of poverty, but it's a precondition for getting out of poverty. So I think the housing story is absolutely essential. I just wanted to use a tiny space here to talk about violence, because it comes and goes in conversations. And to de-romanticize slums and social capital and the sort of idea that everybody's harmoniously or not harmoniously together. And to say that I think that the impact on urban violence, on urban opportunities, is absolutely fundamental. And it's not something that can be tinkered with and gone away with. And it affects transport, fundamentally, and the way that large numbers of people cannot travel because of the way that they are attacked and robbed and raped on public transport systems. It affects household enterprises. We've just been doing some work in Santiago in Chile, a middle-income country, middle-income society, and finding that actually the drug economy is so important within low-income households that there are enormous violence between members of the family if they will not get involved. In other words, if women refuse to sell drugs, they get attacked by their partners. If sons are on drugs, they attack their mothers. There are whole issues going on around the drug economy, around violence, which I think means that it's not, I mean, I absolutely follow you about employment and the relationship between young men and the links to employment. That's very, very clear. But I think we need to mainstream. Years ago, I used to work on gender, and we had to mainstream gender into development. And I've decided that what one has to start thinking about is mainstreaming violence reduction into slum upgrading. There's a ton of slum upgrading that's going on. I don't totally disagree that it doesn't work. I think some slum upgrading has been very successful. But I just wanted to flag it as this issue, that the whole issue of violence and how it affects opportunities is fundamental. And finally, just to say that I think we have to move from these snapshots, that people do collaborate and work together, and there's a ton of social capital when they need it. But as soon as they move on and they have other things to do, then it declines. So looking at processes in these cities rather than at points in time. But I just feel the violence issue comes and goes, and it actually is so structurally fundamental now in many places that we need to incorporate it into our thinking about how it can actually erode a just city.
Thanks. We're going to have to wind down a little bit, but I'd like the mayor maybe to talk a little bit about this, because crime is such a big topic about urban life these days.
I don't think you could be more right. That's why in the worst economy we've had in 80 years, we have done two things. We have, one, had a surge in compassion. When I got elected mayor, we had closed every single recreation center in the city of Atlanta, closed almost every single pool. We're really retreating on every front. We've now reopened every one of them, changed fundamentally the programming in them, but at the exact same time, we've hired more than 525 police officers in a budget that is much smaller. So our city is at 1960s levels in terms of its overall safety, because I understand fundamentally that the biggest job I have is to keep folks safe, and that business and opportunity and prosperity won't come where people can't walk around and function. So no job is coming there. People will not move there if we don't provide the kind of public safety that we have. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, it's interesting. We one of our grantees that we work with in Kibera, it's a project called MAP Kibera, and one of the things they did was they went into the community, and they in a massive kind of community engagement process got the community to participate in mapping what's going on in the community. They put and the first thing that the community wanted to do was map areas of violence. And they did that, and then they were able to then get what was really absent in a place like Kibera, which is the public investment to contain the crime. And so what did they do? They said, well, these are the places where women do not feel safe, so let's put a little police post there. And within just months, they were able to really reduce kind of the level of violence and the incidence of violence significantly. And it was part of really just channeling the interests of the people who live there. Yeah. Because violence for them was so kind of a big and nasty part of what their life was like. All right, so I think we've run out of time. And I hope you found this entertaining and engaging. I hope you were able to kind of see at least part of the vision that we have of a just city, just and prosperous and sustainable cities, are finding ways to connect all the citizens in the cities to the promise that we have in cities. And I want you to join me in thanking our panel and all the people brave enough to get up here and join us on the stage. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
And if I may finish that, Mike, if you allow me. When you think about it, we all have a theory of change. We all have our success indicators. We all have our ecosystem. But what's interesting here is that, with people like Mac and Pablo, we have 3 human beings here, 3 different organizations, 3 different visions, and complementary. And that's, I think, is when we're talking about, building inclusive cities, but also the inclusive movement. There's no one single solution. There are many, and the problem is how we can work together, and this seems to be happening. Because there's, again, there's not a single solution, it's a mix of solutions and a mix of problems. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks.